Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, and welcome to Critical Conversations, a discussion which bridges interdisciplinary perspectives on issues posing critical challenges to humanity. Today's Critical Conversations discussion is entitled Saber, Rattling, and Red Lines, NATO, Russia, and the Threat of War in Ukraine. My name is Anne Fitzgerald. I'm the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and I'm delighted to host this episode of Critical Conversations. Welcome to all of you in the audience today. If you have any questions for the panelists, please submit these questions via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to channel those questions to the appropriate panelists, particularly towards the end of today's session. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. One of the actions we take here in Canada to advance reconciliation between the settler and the Indigenous peoples is to reflect on our relationship with the land and the continuous process of colonization that deeply impacts our work. Acknowledging the land is the process of deliberately naming that this is Indigenous land and Indigenous peoples have rights to this land. The Balsillie School of International Affairs is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations, that includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, which is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. I'd also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the important link between colonization and the oppression of Black people here in Canada, and the allyship between Indigenous people and Black communities in Canada. As such, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is also taking place during Black History Month. We're honored and privileged today to welcome 3 global thought leaders on issues related to Russia, Ukraine, and the wider region. Alexander Lanoszka writes on issues relating to alliance politics and theories of war, with a particular focus on Central and Eastern Europe. He's a scholar here in Waterloo of international relations in the Department of Political Science at University of Waterloo and the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Previously, he taught at City, University of London, and held fellowships at MIT and Dartmouth College. His most recent book is entitled Military Alliances in the 21st Century. Jill Sinclair is a distinguished fellow at the Canada School of Public Service and a fellow at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. She's been a member of Canada's Defence, International Security, Foreign and Public Policy community for most of her professional career. She currently serves as Canada's representative to the Ukraine Defence Reform Advisory Board. She served as Assistant Deputy Minister, Policy at the Department of National Defence and was the Executive Director, Strategic Leadership and Engagement at the Canadian Defence Academy. Prior to her work at the Department of National Defence, she was Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet at the Privy Council Office's Foreign and Defence Policy Secretariat. With Foreign Service postings in Prague, Havana, and the Middle East, as Canada's envoy to the Middle East peace process, she was also Director General of the International Security Bureau and led Ottawa process to ban landmines and the responsibility to protect. She was Canada's first ambassador for mine action. Lee Sarti is an adjunct professor of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and a senior fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, Carleton University. He is also a senior fellow at the Bill Graham Centre for Contemporary International History, the University of Toronto. Educated at Toronto's Trinity College, Carleton University, and Columbia University in New York, Lee joined the Canadian Department of External Affairs, as it was known then, in 1993, serving abroad in Beijing, twice in Moscow, between 1996 and 1999, and then again in Moscow between 2012 and 2016. At headquarters, he served as director for Russia, among other countries, from 2007 to 2012, and was the Director General for Europe before his appointment as Global Affairs Canada Scholar in Residence in 2018. He retired from Global Affairs Canada in 2021. So thank you, all of you, for joining us today for this very timely and interesting discussion. Alexander, I want to start with you. I want you to tell the audience about this crisis, why this crisis now, what is this crisis all about, And why is it taking place this way in 2022? Over to you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. So I would say, first of all, that there has been a war that's been waging in eastern Ukraine since 2014, a war that has resulted in over 13,000 dead and counting, in part because there are continued ceasefire violations that are continuing on a daily basis. Why now? Well, I think what has happened is that since 2019, there has been a growing sense in the Kremlin that Ukraine is increasingly disinterested in resolving the Donbass crisis, at least on Russia's terms. I think when Zolensky, the current president of Ukraine, took power, there was this optimism in Moscow that he would be more open to dialogue on issues related to the Donbass. And those feelings of optimism have not panned out. To the contrary, Ukraine has been tilting ever westward, integrating itself more and more by pursuing various forms of defense cooperation, by expanding its intake of military assistance. In fact, Zolensky has also gone after some of Putin's close associates. And so I think there's this deeper sense that Ukraine is getting away. And with Europe being divided on issues relating to Russia, with the Biden administration increasingly focused, despite its transatlantic credentials, on the Indo-Pacific region, I think there was this sense in Moscow that there was this window of opportunity that should seize to try to regain what influence Moscow lost over Kyiv and try to get Ukraine to resolve the Donbass question on terms favorable to Russia, as well as to relitigate the European security order.
So Jill, just turning to you now, we're hearing a lot of perspective from the Russian side. This crisis is about Ukraine. We're not hearing much about Ukraine. So can you tell us from your perspective, you've worked in Ukraine for many years, senior advisor to the, joined by other senior advisors on the Defense Advisory Board. Tell us a little bit more about the Ukraine perspective.
Well, thanks, Anne, and thanks for putting this panel together. Alex has touched on some of the kind of the key issues here. And I guess what I'd like to say is that Ukraine has become very much forgotten in this crisis, in the sense that in many senses, this is about NATO and Russia. This is about Russia and the United States. And I always think it's healthy to just remember this country that we're talking about, Ukraine, vibrant democracy, independent for, three decades, has had a rough run of it. I'm grateful to Alex for reminding everybody that this isn't about, a possible invasion of Ukraine. It would be an additional invasion of Ukraine. It's this era of misinformation. Let's remember that, that there was the Euromaidan protests when Ukrainians in 2014 decided they very much wanted to be part of the European family, the European community. Europe is very much the trajet, the approach that Ukrainians are looking for, integration into the Euro-Atlantic family, which requires reform and all sorts of changes in Ukraine that we can talk about. This is written into the constitution of Ukraine. This isn't a spontaneous combustion by Ukraine to say that it wants to be part of Europe. It is part of Europe. And it is important to remember that indeed, Russia invaded Crimea after Ukrainians decided decisively that they wanted to take to the streets to actually be part of the EU. So this conflict, this challenge, has a lot to do with where Russia sees Europe, what it considers to be its threat environment. And I do think that when you look at Ukraine as a growing democracy with an innovative economy, a vibrant civil society, and a population that wants to join the EU and NATO, those are perhaps some more of the threats than the Crimea and Donbass, which is used as the easy excuse.
Thanks, Jill. So you've given a Ukraine perspective. Lee, in your writing and commentary, you've described Russia, and in fact, you've described China as well, as fragile authoritarians. So can you expand on this? What do you mean by this?
Sure, and let me also say thank you very much for the invitation to participate this morning. Well, when I say fragile, I certainly do not, repeat, do not, mean to imply that neither Russia nor China is a challenge or a threat that needs to be taken seriously and managed. Of course, these are two great powers. They are both nuclear armed great powers. They are authoritarian states whose values and interests are in conflict with those of the West. That's all a given. But for reasons we could get into if we have time, international relations is a realm where, for good reasons, threats should be exaggerated. It's good to err on the side of caution in an environment where mistakes can prove fatal. And I think that phenomenon leads to a situation where, in focusing on the challenges from Russia and China, we tend to overlook real shortcomings in both countries, specifically Russia, I'll focus on this morning, that are useful to keep in mind in terms of informing our policy going forward. That when you take Russia, remembering it's an authoritarian state, legitimacy is always a challenge in authoritarian states. So Putin, he seems to be quite solidly in charge, but is always juggling internal challenges that are opaque to us, but nevertheless there. There is awareness of chronic corruption, capital flight that is corroding the Russian state as we speak. And I think the most important aspect of fragility is the fear in Moscow of what they term colored revolutions. This is a term that dates back to earlier in the Cold War, the first efforts of states in the former Soviet space to realize democratic change got color monikers for reasons that would take us a bit far afield, the most prominent being the Orange Revolution in Ukraine back in 04-05. But when you think about, and when you read what specialists and policymakers in Russia think about colored revolution, when you put aside the ridiculous degree of conspiring that they impart to their Western counterparts, and think about the fears that drive these concerns, they're driven ultimately by a recognition that they are on the wrong side of history, that Putinism, let alone Xi Jinping thought, don't have any of the draw that Western freedoms and free markets have. And so I think we need to be aware of the insecurities that also that feed into Russian and Chinese behavior, and take that into account as we develop our policies going forward.
I want to push on President Vladimir Putin for a moment. And back to you, Lee. It's often said that Vladimir Putin is playing chess, even three-dimensional chess, while the West is barely playing checkers. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, I strongly disagree with this kind of view, and it relates to what I was just saying about our tendency to see the other as more coherent, more strategic than we ourselves somehow are. I think the most that can be said about Vladimir Putin is that he is playing his weak hand well, but the notion that his intentions and abilities are somehow opaque, that he's operating on some higher level, frankly escapes me. I mean, his purposes could not be clearer. Alex, I love that term, relitigate the end of the Cold War. That's what Putin is trying to do. And through his actions, this buildup outside of Ukraine and all the diplomacy that's been surrounding it. And I find it striking and worth emphasizing that as Putin seeks to do this, given the shortcomings of his authoritarian regime that I was alluding to earlier, Russia's complete absence of what we call soft power, its ability to win support through its ideas and let alone its economic model, the fact that that's non-existent, Putin, like Russian leaders for centuries before him, I would say, is using the one surefire tool that is at his disposal, and that is his military power. It's a blunt instrument. It's a dangerous instrument. Again, it's a challenge we need to take seriously. But again, I think it's important that we not build him up to be somehow more farsighted, more all-knowing than he in fact actually is.
Thanks for that. So let's just pick up on that reference to military power as a blunt instrument. And Alex, can we just go to the role of NATO? Tell us what NATO has done so far. Is there any possibility of NATO being dragged into a conflict between Ukraine and Russia?
So I would say no, in part because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. It is an enhanced opportunities partner, just like Sweden, Finland, and Georgia are. And so it does cooperate with Ukraine, with NATO, pardon me, on a number of different, in a number of different areas. But I think because there is no stated commitment that offsets the so-called entrapment risks that many analysts do worry about with respect to Ukraine and Russia. Indeed, members of NATO have been very careful on what sort of military assistance they've been providing to that country, precisely because they're worried about Ukraine having offensive capabilities that could be then used to pursue some sort of offensive that no one wants to see. So I suspect that the entrapment risks are actually far less severe, if severity is even the appropriate adjective here, than what many people suggest. But it still has a role. After all, because Ukraine is an enhanced opportunities partner, NATO is implicated. And indeed, Russia has drafted treaties that demand, like I said, the relitigation of the European security order. One of those treaties was directed at NATO itself, and that treaty proposed that NATO basically withdraw what deterrence and defense measures have been put in place since May 27th, 1997, the date of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, in effect calling for NATO to neutralize or neuter itself in Central Eastern Europe by depriving its allies that have joined the alliance since then of any military support. So this goes well beyond the question of Ukrainian membership in NATO. In fact, Russia has called on NATO countries to suspend any form of military assistance or activity on not only Ukrainian territory, but Transcaucasian, Central Asian, and Eastern European territory. And I suspect that Russia has made these demands precisely because there are non-starters. They're going to be dismissed flat out, in part because at the end of the day, Russia is not interested in talking with NATO. It is interested in talking with the United States.
So how would you characterize the role of NATO enlargement then? Because that's the process, right? Where is this going? What are going to be the pushbacks? Where's the settling ground? Jill says that Ukraine is already part of Europe. So what role is NATO enlargement playing?
So a number of commentators, especially those in Russia, have pointed to NATO enlargement as being some sort of existential threat that is driving Russian decision-making in this crisis. I don't agree with that view whatsoever. In fact, one can interpret Ukraine's status as an enhanced opportunities partner as a way to keep Ukraine perpetually in some sort of holding room, precisely because there are internal disagreements within the alliance on the question of Ukraine membership. France and Germany in 2008 were opposed to the offer of a membership action plan to Ukraine and Georgia that would have provided the way forward to eventual membership. Of course, in 2008, there was a statement to the effect that Ukraine and Georgia would one day become members, but there was never really a time frame ever given, and I suspect that was just a compromise. But that being said, Putin has certainly alluded to that statement as some sort of cudgel against NATO. So I suspect other things are going on here. I think Putin knows that the actual prospects for Ukrainian membership in NATO are very slim. I would caution against any policy that advises that Canada and its allies should abandon the open door policy. I don't think it's a good idea to have Russia essentially rewrite the Washington Treaty. This is Article 10 that calls on, or allows rather, any aspiring country to join the alliance so long as it has unanimous consent of its membership. It's not wise to make that sort of concession when Russia is not making any sort of concession on its own. Paradoxically, that concession would be very credible on the part of NATO, precisely because of the internal disagreements within the alliance. But Russia cannot credibly promise not to use military force against Ukraine, precisely because it has been using military force against Ukraine since 2014. So it's unwise to make that sort of concession, not least because it would be very alienating to Ukraine as well as to potential partners like Sweden and Finland. But we're not getting anything in return, and Russia might simply pocket it and ask for more.
So Jill, just continuing on the NATO theme for one last question. Ukraine says it wants to be part of the Euro-Atlantic community, but is this real? So what about reform, corruption, and everything else it's contending with?
Thanks, Anne. Before I kind of grab onto that, I just want to come back on something that Alex said about where he was talking about whether there was any credibility in what Russia could, deliver by way of assurances. And I just like to kind of say, no, there is none, because let's remember there was a Budapest memorandum too, that when Ukraine voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons in order to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state, Russia, along with a number of other countries, made guarantees about the security and the inviolability of that territory, which have proven for naught, because Russia has invaded Crimea, occupies Crimea, and has been waging a war in the eastern part of Ukraine for the last number of years. So I just think we have to be kind of careful there. It doesn't mean there's no space to negotiate with Russia. There's massive space to negotiate with Russia. Those draft treaties are a delight. They are full of things that one could talk to Russia about, including confidence building measures and new arms control approaches and all sorts of things that we forgotten about. But I think we have to be very careful about not giving Russia this sense that there is any space for spheres of influence in 2022, because there aren't. Ukraine is independent. Now, to answer your question, and apologies for going on a bit longer here. Yeah, I mean, just like all members that have gone with membership action plans and have sought to join NATO, there are things that members need to do to become a member of this political military alliance. And I want to reinforce, NATO is a political military alliance. It's not just about military interoperability. It is about the political, the democratic development, and that is where Ukraine is pointing itself. Okay, is it going, full speed out to try to make these changes across the range of society, political institutions? It is. Is it difficult? Is there a lot of work to be done? For sure. But if you look at the context that Ukraine is working in, let's remember conflict. They don't have an easy time of it. They have been doing reform across the defense sector, the security sector, land reform, education. There are lots of challenges still, judicial in particular, and corruption. But Ukraine is determined to integrate itself into the Euro-Atlantic community, and it knows that it needs to change just about everything in society. And I can tell you, Anne, including from recent conversations this week with Ukrainians in the defense ministry, they aren't putting reform aside even in the midst of the current crisis. They are driving forward because they know that a reformed, democratic, resilient, prosperous Ukraine is exactly what Russia doesn't want, not because it will be a threat, but because it might be a model.
Yes, of course, because while you've got wolves at the door, you've got to pay attention to them, but keep a big picture going on at the same time, right? So Lee, just continuing on that perspective from the Ukraine side of things, many of the analysts out there are talking about the importance of history, or quote unquote versions of history, for understanding the current crisis in Ukraine. What is your take on this?
Yeah, just I would, before I answer, would like to pick up on and emphasize the point that Jill just made. Couldn't agree more that the big driver of Putin's fear is the notion Ukraine as a model, prosperous, democratic, Western-leaning state on Russia's border. That's beautifully put, Jill. I couldn't say it better myself. But in terms of history, I think history is a huge part of this subject. And I refer everybody to the great piece that Serhiy Plokhy of Harvard had in the FT, I think just at the beginning of this week, on the specific aspect of things. And I think history is important, and it's problematic because it's complex. And if there's one thing that certainly a world that is framed by social media, where sound bites and clickbait are the standard. One thing that world does not like is complexity. Vastly preferred is a simple world of black and white, where these issues can all be boiled down to Putin bad, evil, everybody else good. And obviously, no one would actually hold to such a caricature. But the spirit of what I'm saying is why I think it's important to be cognizant of the importance of history and its complexity. We need to remind ourselves that at its roots, I mean, we could take the roots of this conflict, according to some lights, could go back to the 19th century, could go back to the 17th century, and the nature of Ukrainian statehood. I'm not going there, but as recently as we need to think about the end of the Cold War, remind ourselves what a truly bizarre conflict that was. Remember, it was called the Cold War because it never went hot, thank goodness. The world never went up in a nuclear conflagration. But it did end, as wars are known to end, in the complete defeat of the losing side, the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, frankly. But as opposed to other big wars as recently as the 20th century, the defeat of Imperial Japan or even the defeat of Nazi Germany, in both those cases, those powers were occupied and ultimately transformed from the authoritarian states that fomented hideous conflict earlier in the 20th century to the democratic members of the Western community as we know them today. Of course, that didn't happen in the case of the Soviet Union. We had this unprecedented situation that we in the West and our post-Soviet partners managed as best we could, but was less than ideal from the perspective of the Russians, particularly now 30 years on, as Putin represents those many forces in Russia who feel that Russia was dealt a bad deal, as one would expect the loser to be dealt in a conflict, but I digress. And now, 30 years on, again, this great term that Alex has used, I think is very important, this relitigate the end of the Cold War. And this is the situation, they're using the situation around Ukraine and their deployment of military force, and they are playing with history. They are playing extremely fast and loose with history as part of their effort to again, rewrite the post-Cold War settlement. So I think it's important as we manage these issues day to day, even as in every interaction, we obviously can't dip into these complexities. We need to be aware that this is part of the backdrop and part of the challenge we all face.
Great point, Lee. And I think we're seeing that playing out in different parts of the world as well. That attempt to power grab is an attempt to cling on to history and relitigate, as Alex was saying. Can I just push on you for one more question related to that? You have an impressive CV, 30 years of which have been spent with Global Affairs Canada and on and in Russia. So does this make you more of an optimist or a pessimist where the current situation is concerned?
Yeah, well, I'd say I'm both. And there's lots of old Russian jokes about optimists and pessimists that I won't get, but I would wimp out and say I'm a bit of both. And the experience I've had makes me optimistic in the sense that I feel very proud of and gratified for key aspects of current Canadian policy. I think our role, our leadership role in NATO's enhanced forward presence in Latvia is it's a wonderful thing, and I'm proud to have been part of the institution that played some role in supporting that deployment. I applaud as well how front and center we are in our support for Ukraine, so well articulated here and implemented by my old friend Jill Sinclair. And most importantly, having been at GAC and in government, I have enormous respect and admiration for the quality of analysis that I know is being delivered, the expertise on these issues. What makes me pessimistic, I would say, is I have the feeling, and this really is perhaps more the reflections of a retired former member of that embattled institution known as GAC, but I have the feeling that I have the impression that Canadian foreign policy today, including in our approach on these important issues, is perhaps a mile wide and an inch deep. In other words, while we, Canada, are doing certain very key important things to contribute to the broader Western cause in dealing with these issues, I think it's at the expense of engaging in the deeper rethink about where the world is going, particularly in light of changes that are taking place in our neighbor to the south. And there's a reflex, I think, at our political level to fall back on good sounding slogans and saying the words, of course, we support freedom, we support democracy, without taking a hard look at the real ways in which that is being challenged, not only from the likes of Russia and China, but some challenges we're facing here in the West. And that tempers my optimism to an increasingly significant degree.
Thank you for that. Alex, over to you. Let's look forward now. So how do you think this conflict may de-escalate, or is military action inevitable? It's quite a buildup of military kit and hardware along the border and personnel.
Right. No, so that's what makes me pessimistic. I think Russia is building up a very credible fighting force along multiple vectors near Ukraine's border. To my understanding, there are at least 70 battalion size battle groups, battalion tactical groups, BTGs, that are poised, and they certainly have the materiel to carry out operations of some size. I don't think that Russia intends on going as far as to try to encircle Kyiv and to force the capitulation of the government, as some observers have hypothesized. I think it will probably, if we will use military force, we'll try to use long-range strikes, perhaps to compel some sort of settlement. Of course, the record of compellence in international relations is very limited, and so it'll be bloody and violent, but probably not successful, not strategically at least. More likely is some sort of effort to further the passportization of those living in eastern Ukraine, and to perhaps use the military force that is positioned in eastern Ukraine or near eastern Ukraine to seize that territory. I think the problem is that the combat force is credible and the rhetoric brooks very little compromise. And so some have argued that Putin has backed himself into a corner and will have very little to show for. The option to de-escalate is always there. He can always pull back forces. So this is a crisis of his own making, so to speak. But I don't think he's done all of this work, which now includes apparently positioning blood reserves that suggest that they're expecting casualties, without getting anything in return. I don't even think talking about ground-based intermediate range missiles with the United States is exactly the prize that they're trying to get here. So I think there is some real potential for military action. I just don't know what the scale is, but I suspect there will be something.
Thanks for that. Jill, I've had the great pleasure and privilege of working in Ukraine at the same time as you. As you know, I've also been working in the Horn of Africa. We're seeing a real surge of this new type of conflict, warfare, disinformation, misinformation, the use of information as a tool of war. Let's take this to what's happening in Ukraine. This is certainly not the first time that we're seeing this. So can you talk about your views on this? It's something that's really being discussed at the national security level of many NATO countries at the moment.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, and I think it flows a bit from the question you put to Alex, because I think we have to think about the role of the military and armed conflict in an era of hybrid war. So, Lee was talking about history. I always think about Clausewitz and war being the continuation of politics by other means. And I think that in an era when you can destabilize, you can control an agenda, you can get attention without actually having to cross somebody's border with armed force, it brings a whole other dimension to what it means to be in conflict. And I think when we look at Russia, Ukraine, certainly the Russians, Ukraine has been a living laboratory for Russian hybrid warfare for a number of years now. And this includes misinformation and disinformation. Lee, you were talking about history. We can see how history can be weaponized. And there's been some very creative rewriting of history and new narratives put out there, including by President Putin. Very interesting, but it is just to generate the interest, to generate the case, to generate the credibility, the legitimacy of the ask for Ukraine as a territory by trying to dismiss Ukraine as an independent sovereign country. And then there are the things that we're becoming increasingly familiar with, and that is, weaponizing energy. Just think of where, Germany sits in this issue and the factors that are contributing to its consideration of how it deals with Russia. Major one is energy security and energy supply. So in an era when basically all instruments of state power are available if you're going to fight hybrid wars, it's good to have the kit and the tanks and all that sort of stuff. And it's very helpful to concentrate people's minds by massing at borders. And I do want to just open a bracket here and say it isn't just about what's going on the border with Russia, but I think of equal and perhaps greater concern is what's going on in Belarus and in the Black Sea. Don't forget, Ukraine is encircled here, and Ukraine is becoming a little bit the punching bag for some broader interests that Russia has in destabilizing, and they've been able to use their hybrid techniques, their cyber attacks in the Baltic countries, in Ukraine. Who knows what happened at GAC recently? So this is a different type of warfare, and I think what is so difficult and challenging here, and whether we're talking about Ukraine or more broadly, is how do you provide effective deterrence when you're in hybrid situations of warfare, when a cyber attack could bring down your electricity grid? How do you deter against that effectively? What are the package of instruments that countries have? Are economic sanctions either deployed proactively or after the fact actually going to concentrate minds the way you would like? But I certainly think that if anybody is interested in understanding hybrid warfare, talking to the Ukrainians who live it on a daily basis in absolutely every dimension would be very, very useful to do.
Thanks for that, Jill. And thanks for reminding us how much this form of warfare, because of the internet and social media, plays out right in our home turf as well. Lee, the US policy is obviously key to seeing us through this crisis, as is the case for other conflicts ongoing around the world at the moment. But smaller allies like Canada do what they can. How do you assess President Biden's Russia policy?
Well, I think I'd answer in the same spirit as when I was talking about my perspectives on global affairs earlier. I'm on the one hand relatively optimistic, but I'm more, I think, pessimistic for the longer term. I'm optimistic in the sense that certainly a very welcome contrast to his predecessor in his obvious readiness to turn to the seasoned advice that is available to him at the US State Department, in the intelligence community and elsewhere. Biden's, so his instincts are clearly sound. His efforts to explicitly rally democratic states and underline the degree to which we have shared interests and values that together are certainly well more than a match for those of our authoritarian rivals in the international system. This is all good. Anthony Blinken knows his stuff. He wrote a book. He wrote a book about the politics of energy policy, even back in Europe, back in the 1980s. So lots that's positive. There certainly was, I think, an unforgivable own goal when Biden was prominently speculating out loud about the potential difficulties that NATO would face if Russia did a sort of minor incursion, how this would, to articulate that this could cause some dissent within the alliance. Was far from helpful. I think they have successfully backed away from that, but it was certainly a bit sobering. I think that the big challenge, and I was speaking about it earlier because it's so important to Canada, is the state of American democracy itself. And I can't help but refer to, there's a famous, back in when the Cold War was just getting underway, there was a very famous article published anonymously in the American journal Foreign Affairs, in fact, written by George Kennan, who then was the director of state of policy planning at the US State Department. He had served in Moscow, a real specialist. And he wrote this article that is often referred back to as the sort of the blueprint for the containment strategy that the US adopted in the Cold War. And it's really interesting to go back and see, whatever we are, more than 70 years later, and see that Kennan's resounding conclusion at that time was to assert that in order to ultimately prevail in what then seemed to be this Manichaean contest with this imposing Soviet Union, the US, and I'll quote Kennan, need only measure up to its own best traditions. In other words, pointing out that the strength of American democracy, its support for free markets, et cetera, everything that came with that was the key to prevailing in the Cold War. And when we think about that perspective today, and just the litany of developments that are actively straining American power and the implications, certainly for us here north of the border, but for the world, it's very sobering indeed. From the hideous events of last January 6th to the continued, the statistics on the number of Americans who believe the election was stolen, to the this really brings it close to home, indications that this business we're facing here in Ottawa and in other places, these protests, is funded from money that is coming from the States. All this speaks to extremely disquieting trends in democracy writ large. And to go back to a point when the whole premise of my calling Russia and China fragile is to underline the unimpeachable superiority of our system as opposed to theirs. But that doesn't mean we're not capable, it would seem, of shooting ourselves in the foot with perilous consequences, not only for our current efforts to manage Putin's latest shenanigans, but dealing with China, the second largest economy on the planet, going forward. So I hate to, hopefully the audience questions will lead to a lighter tone. I hate to conclude on such a gloomy note, but those are my thoughts.
No worries, realities of conflict. Alex, just continuing on the Canada theme, but I mean, there's middle and small powers in NATO writ large. So what's Canada done so far? Do you think it's doing enough? What's the role for a country like Canada in this kind of conflict and state of tension?
So Canada has actually done more than most NATO countries, as a matter of fact, with respect to Ukraine. In fact, a little more than half have not even given any form of military assistance to Ukraine, and there are 30 members. And of those countries that do provide military assistance, only a handful actually have military advisors on the ground in Ukraine, and Canada has 260 of them, 200 generally since Operation Unifier came into being, but the Trudeau government has recently announced a further 60. And Canada has given various packages of non-lethal aid. It did provide RadarSat-2 technology, which did assist Ukraine in having greater situational awareness and the ability to monitor Russian troop movements. Unfortunately, Canada has withdrawn that provision of aid. More recently, Canada has agreed to a new package of non-lethal aid, largely consisting of such things like armored vests, nighttime goggles, first aid kits, helmets, military radios, and so forth. I do think, though, that there's a bit of a disconnect in some aspects of Canadian policy. So when Canada announced that provision of non-military aid, or non-lethal aid more specifically, a few days ago, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland at the same time more or less said that Canada sees this conflict as one between democracy and autocracy, which invites the question, if that's really the case, then why is Canada not doing even more? Why is it not actually fulfilling some of Ukraine's own requests? Because after all, Ukraine wants much more from Canada than what it is currently getting in the form of non-lethal aid. It wants anti-aircraft systems, surveillance systems, and surveillance technologies. So there's a bit of a disconnect there, and the reason stated by Trudeau was that diplomacy needs to be first and foremost the solution to the crisis. But again, that's confusing because we do have military advisors on the ground there. So it's not like we're not doing anything militarily. And Canada, to my mind, has not proposed any innovative diplomatic solutions to address this particular crisis. It has emphasized deterrence over dialogue with Russia. But be that as it may, Canada still does a lot more than most NATO countries.
Great, thanks, Alex. I just want to turn to some of the questions in the audience at the moment. Jill, I'm going to try you on this first question from Professor Besma Mamani. She's asking, why is Zolensky playing down the Russian threat?
Thanks, Besma. I can't see you, but great to know you're out there. Look, and I just like to sort of something that Alex just talked about. We don't have military advisors as much as we have a military training mission. And I want to be precise about that because Putin has said repeatedly that we have military missions in Ukraine. And in fact, we don't, we have training missions. And I think that, were the world a slightly wiser place, maybe you'd actually, in the old days, you'd invite them to come and observe that. If we were looking at the old days of the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, or we were looking at the old Vienna document. So I do think it's very important there to just to note that. So yeah, Besma, so let's pretend that we're sitting in a country that's under threat, either from a pandemic or from an unfriendly neighbor. Are we going to sort of prepare for the worst and try to keep our population kind of calm? Are we going to try to inculcate resilience? And I have to tell you, the Ukrainian people are massively resilient. There's almost nothing they haven't seen in their history. They've been marauded over through the entirety of global history. And I think that Zelensky is not playing down the threat. I think that he is doing what a leader should do, which is he's preparing for the threat. Just today, he was talking again about the need for more weapons to ensure that Ukraine can defend itself. And deterrence and defense is a very good and important instrument to have along with diplomacy. But he also wants to make sure that there isn't total flight of capital from his country, because this is a country, he's looking at the long game. He knows that the West's attention is going to flit off to something else at some point, right? But he is still going to have to provide prosperity, a functioning economy, try to bring investment to the country. So he is trying to deal with some of those macro things, Besma, I would say. And he also is trying to keep his population calm so that they are able to kind of get on with life. And I know there's been quite a bit of criticism about Zelensky for this. But I do recall, and I'm trying to think who it was, might have been like a Second World War. There was this slogan, keep calm and carry on. Nobody accused Winston Churchill of being soft on his adversaries.
Great, Jill, thanks. And I think it's important to recognize that like a major insurgency effort is to bring down the legitimacy of your opponent, right? And so certainly that draws on what Russia will be aspiring to do. Lee, there's a question in from James Sayer. Surely Russia has achieved its strategic objectives already by occupying Donbass and Crimea, in that this alone effectively stops Ukraine joining NATO and the EU, as ongoing conflicts prevent membership to these organizations. So what is left to achieve by Russia other than total domination and the return of Ukraine to Russian hegemony? Also, he'd like to know if you think that an invasion is likely or not. His Ukrainian friends in Kiev see no threat and cannot believe or see an invasion. So can you speak to that point, please?
Wow, yeah, sure, with pleasure. I think to the first part, it's clear that Putin's objectives are broader, and we've been touching on this. And this, again, at the risk of trying people's ears, I'll say it again, this is relitigate the end of the Cold War, that obviously the focus today is Ukraine. It's the focal point of Putin's concerns for many of the reasons that we've been touching on in the course of this panel. But the aspirations are nothing less than, when we say that, relitigate the end of the Cold War, it's about restructuring the security architecture of Europe, and along lines that Russia finds agreeable. So in that sense, his objectives do go beyond Ukraine. And so it's not quite enough to have, well, while it's true, as the questioner points out, that the Russian efforts to date, particularly in the Donbass, and their unfortunate influence on Ukraine, have effectively helped to stymie Ukraine's NATO aspirations. Given that Putin's purposes are broader, he's not inclined to, say, good, done and dusted, I have what I need. In terms of an invasion, I'm gratified to hear that friends in Kiev don't feel it's likely. I certainly, for me, I'm concerned. I would come back to Jill reminded us of von Clausewitz's famous that war is the continuation of politics by other means, and this also takes me back to my points about Putin as alleged chess master. Leads me to conclude, he certainly does not want to invade. He does not want to invade, and that hopefully makes invasion less likely. What he wants are the fruits of his military threats. He wants to compel the US to sit down. His dream would be, and Jill was articulately dissing this earlier, but his dream would be a Yalta II, a kind of agreement on spheres of influence between the US, and this would win recognition of Russia as a great power and the respect that it's due. This would help consolidate Putin's position at home, etc. But the actual, I think we do have to, without, again, making light of the challenge, we have to give the guy at least some credit for not being completely irrational and not appreciating how hard the Western reaction to even a slight incursion would hurt the Russian economy, would hurt his standing, let alone the potential for even a slight incursion to get out of hand. This is one of the clearest lessons of world history, that of crisis management, that whatever the ultimate intentions of its perpetrators, it's easy for any crisis to get out of hand. So I would like to be able to say, no, there's no threat of invasion, but of course that's not, because again, either through miscalculation or depending on how things unfold, things could get so desperate that Putin feels he really has no choice to pull the trigger. But contrary to the adjective imminent that has been used with regard to a potential Russian invasion since, I think, November, I'm hopeful that one is not.
Thanks, Lee. Can you just give me a 30-second augmentation on that answer? There are three questions that are focusing on Putin and his goals to drive a wedge between the US and Europe, and dividing Europe through decreased energy supply and an energy crisis. And somebody's also written to me and said, undermining Putin, will that not have catastrophic effects globally? Can you just, push that point for another 30 seconds?
Yeah, well, sure. The questions that you've referred to are simply listing the further tools that Putin sees as being at his disposal in order to push these ends. Again, the ends remain, I think, reasonably constant in terms of the ideals. I mean, they were spelled out to an extreme degree that no one can take seriously in their talk of these new treaties that they proposed. You know, dead on arrival, of course, but the aspirations reflected in those treaties remain real. And in addition to this buildup on the borders of Ukraine, Putin, like his Soviet and Tsarist predecessors, is not shy about doing what he can to exploit differences in interests within the West, to play the energy card shamelessly in the same way that he's playing his military deployments on the borders of Ukraine. This all is part of the mix, but we shouldn't lose sight of the I think, relative clarity and simplicity of his ultimate goal, namely that the way the European security architecture is structured with NATO's prominent role, that needs to be revised in favor of a structure that favors Russia's, that acknowledges and even enshrines Russia's right to do what it wants in the areas it sees as within its sphere of interests.
Thanks so much. Alex, there's a great question on NATO's open door policy. Do you think that this stretches its ability to meet its security commitments? Does it generally complicate things? So at what point does NATO enlargement not necessarily translate into security enhancements?
So I think we have to go back to the 1990s when these discussions were in train. At that time, and it's very easy to forget, there was a lot of pessimism about the future trajectory of European security, not least because of concerns about loose nuclear weapons, ethnic tensions amongst members of the former Warsaw Pact, and so forth and so forth. And the people who were making these sorts of stark predictions about European security actually would go on later to criticize NATO enlargement. But NATO enlargement was actually designed in part to address those very stark predictions that people have made of it. And so there was the sense that by having a security guarantee to countries spanning Central and Eastern Europe, that would more or less provide an arc of stability that would rebound to European benefit. And so as much as there is this concern that now NATO is overstretched and that these additional members are now liabilities, I think that view, unfortunately, mistakes what has been the assessment in the past and how it overlooks the very plausible counterfactual, one made even by critics of NATO enlargement in the early 1990s, that absent in NATO enlargement, we could see far more disarray and far more conflict in Central and Eastern Europe than we are seeing even today.
Thanks so much, Alex. I'm going to give the final question to Jill. There's a question from Tamara Lawrence on oversight, parliamentary oversight, that we sent special forces to Ukraine with insufficient parliamentary and public oversight. Can you address that question and the rest of what's written in it?
Thanks, Anne. At the back end of that question is about more critical analysis and strategic empathy with regard to Russia's kind of perceptions. So with regard to, sending special forces, I mean, we have as a foundational premise the civilian control of the military. So the need for additional parliamentary oversight for the specific deployment, in this case, I think these are special forces that are sent in to help the embassy deal with contingency operations. So I would not see the need for that. We know that the committee, I think, met last night in Parliament discussing Ukraine. These issues can come here. People can, ask the minister to come to parliamentary committee at any point. But at all times, we have strict civilian control of the military. There is accountability through there. With regard to sort of strategic empathy and critical analysis, look, on critical analysis, could not agree more. We're getting a lot of kind of shoot from the hip analysis at the moment, lots of assumptions, whether it's about, will there be an invasion or not? Yeah, I mean, putting troops, on a country's 3 borders, how does that marry up with the intent to actually use them? There's a lot of sophisticated stuff that has to go on here. I wanted to also just mention, there's been this question about the impact of Putin's actions. Well, it has created Ukrainian unity, reinforced it even more than it did the first time round when they went in and took a chunk of Crimea and then fomented war on the eastern part of the country. It also, I think, is driving a little bit of Western unity. Sure, there's disunity. It's always there. Everybody, you stand where you sit, and France is going to be France and the UK themselves, and the Germans, the Germans. But there is much Western unity around here. I mean, weapons, the US, the UK, Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, the Czech Republic, Denmark have all given weapons to Ukraine. There is concentrated focus on Ukraine at the moment. So I think that Putin, again, has had, as Lee said, the unintended consequences of action sometimes are actually, it's made NATO come to the fore. It's reinforced a little bit its raison d'etre. It's had a intensity of strategic convening, which the alliance has not done at that level before. So I mean, be careful what you kind of wish for when you kind of push certain buttons. With regard to strategic empathy, I think there's a very important point here to be made, and it's probably not a bad way to kind of conclude things, but we do need to understand that this is Russia's misbehaving, and Russia's misbehaving for a bunch of different reasons. Some of it is Putin-esque, and some of it is Russia as a major force in history. And, how has the West treated us? Now, the way in which Russia is responding to all of this has not been acceptable. Taking pieces of territory of other countries. But is there space here for a more sensible dialogue? I definitely think so. And if you look at what we can see in the public domain with regard to the response to Russia's fantastical draft treaties, and any negotiator knows you put everything on the table so you get something, is that there's talk again of arms control. Who even remembers arms control? I happen to be been at a lot of those tables, but who talks about arms control? Confidence building measures, transparency, prevention of incidents at sea, hotlines, all the things that you do to manage relationships when you have uncertainty between and amongst partners. So yeah, there could be a massive opportunity here if we can be smart, if we can marry up assertive diplomacy with the force that you need to concentrate people's minds, i.e. it can't just be words, and then look for very creative solutions to not just fall into redesigning space on the basis of what Russia wants, but maybe it is time to think a little bit differently about the Euro-Atlantic space in 2020.
Jill, thanks so much. And thank you. You've been a wonderful panel, all of you. I mean, you're very, very bright people and you're very informed on this issue. I think it's been a timely discussion, slightly over time discussion, but well worth it. So I'm sure the audience would join me in thanking all of you. We hope you'll return to a Balsillie School talk soon, and we hope that the policymakers in the audience benefited from that session too. Thank you so much. Join us again soon.